Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Stan the History Man. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. And today I'd like to talk about the lesser known aspects of the life of Sir Winston Churchill. Actually, things that really don't redound that much to his credit. Now, let me say from the start, I am an avid admirer of Sir Winston. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Sandler and I paid our respects at his funeral in London in January of 1965. And a week or so later, we visited his burial site, rather modest tomb at the great grand ancestral home. Of course, he was a younger son of a Duke of Marlborough, and he had to make his way. But I want to talk about some aspects of Churchill that you may not be aware of. And it's not really knocking him down, just like nobody's perfect. And I want to talk about. And I should also mention that Churchill was a very a moral man. William Gladstone, British Prime Minister of the late uh, late Prime Minister in the late 19th century, said that of all the, I think he said 19 prime ministers, only two had not been adulterers, and I'm sure one of them was Gladstone himself, who was an evangelical Christian. But the fact that Churchill was married to Clementine and faithful to Clementine all of his life is not a minor achievement considering the competition. But anyway, Churchill was not a popular person for much of his career. One of the early things that he did that sort of blighted his career, his popularity, if you will. He went from being originally a conservative, of course, being the younger son of a duke, you might expect that, but then turning to the Liberal Party and then back to the Conservative Party. So both parties really didn't trust him. The idea was, but Churchill is very smart and everything, but he's untrustworthy. His career, one of the earliest things that really blighted his career, I think you could say it almost wrecked it until he became prime minister in 1940, was the Gallipoli campaign. This was the idea that we go through the back door to get to the Germany through Turkey and have an expedition up the Gallipoli peninsula and then take Constantinople. And then we could they'd have the Germans have a lot of trouble in their back door. Well, it was a fiasco. Now, it wasn't Churchill. The idea was Churchill's, and I think he has to, accept the blame for that. But by this time, I should point out that he was Secretary, First Lord of the Admiralty, which is like the head boss of the Admiralty. And I would say because of Gallipoli, the biggest warship graveyard in the world, other than Scapa Flow, where the Germans sank all their fleet practically, would be Gallipoli. Number of 3 battleships, the Irresistible, the Bouvet, and I forget the third one, were sunk there, plus a lot of other ships as well. So this was right here that didn't work at all very well. Mines, Turkish artillery, and I think a great underestimation of the Turkish military. The Turks, I mean, they're just a bunch of barbarians. What do they know against British? Actually, weren't British soldiers. They were Anzacs. They were Australian New Zealanders, and they were slaughtered. And for many years afterwards, Churchill's name was a hissing the byword, if you will, down under in Australia and New Zealand. So Gallipoli was another thing that then between the wars, his career, I don't know if it'd say suffered a blow, but it's something that historians today would probably not think of as highlight of his career during the general strike of 1926, when the British working man went on strike because conditions after the war were, for America, it was a roaring 20s, roaring prosperity, no inflation, no war. For Britain, it was a period of almost not as bad as the Depression, but high unemployment. And so the coal miners went on strike, and then everybody else went on strike. And the only way they kept like the railroads running, they had a lot of rich young men that liked to be engine drivers. I like the English word engine driver better than our word engineer, but anyway, engine drivers, trolley car motormen, that type of thing. And Churchill put out a newspaper called the Briton, and that was to say, like, hooray for these guys who are out there working, keeping Britain running, and these Bolshevik strikers should be kept down. And they did lose the general strike. The mine owners made some concessions. Well, they couldn't even get the miners to put showers in the mines. I mean, come on. That's how bad things were back then. I mean, England ran on coal. You'd treat the miners right. but they went back with some improvement, not very much. And so Churchill got very hatred, if almost hatred, from the Labour Party, which represented the miners and everybody else. So that was another move he made when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, the head of British finances, was he went over the gold standard. And that's debatable. I kind of like the idea of gold. Your dollar's worth that much in gold, but a lot of economists who know more about economy than I do say that this brought about deflation and caused high unemployment in Great Britain during the war. A little later, the sensational abdication of Edward VIII. I think it was the American humorist Will Rogers said, "The greatest event since the resurrection." And when Edward, the Prince of Wales, and gave up he became the king with the death of his father, had been coronated though, gave it up for the love of a twice divorced American woman. Not on, but he was a king's man. Oh, all for every day. He's very romantic. You could say that Churchill, in many respects, was one of the last Victorians. I think there are a fair amount of them still around in the upper crust of England, but he was one of the last. And so he was a king's man. He stood up for Edward VIII. And again, a lot of people said that's a wild man. Look, we can't have Edward VIII as our king, and Wallis Simpson as our queen. So Churchill again he's unstable. Radical, that type of thing. Well, as you know, probably because there have been a lot of films lately upon the death of Queen Elizabeth and so on about how Churchill became prime minister. He actually George VI, when Chamberlain resigned because of the indignation on both parties about his appeasement policy. Both Lord Halifax, who was the conservative lord, who was one of the leaders of the Conservatives, and Churchill, who became a conservative again, were summoned by George VI. That's how the British do things. How they don't elect the prime minister; he's only elected by his constituency, and so it was George VI's job to pick the next prime minister, and he favored Halifax, because he felt the same feeling. Oh, Churchill was a wild man. I mean, he's not. He's just not our type, don't you know? But Halifax had the courage to say, here's the great plum. You can be the next prime minister. No, Your Majesty, as a lord, I would be functioning from the House of Lords, and that's where the Lords hang out. Obviously, I could not, run Parliament that way from the distance of the House of Lords from the House of Commons. And so George III rather reluctantly said, well, Mr. Churchill, he wasn't Sir Winston then, you're our next prime minister. And so I should point out, by the way, that George VI and Churchill, and I think I mentioned that before in an earlier broadcast here, became fast friends. They were really bosom buddies. And when George VI died, Churchill wrote a great encomium about how great he was during the wartime years. Well, Churchill became, I should say before this, I'm jumping ahead and I shouldn't, but Churchill had been, at this time, was First Lord of the Admiralty. And here's where I think he made some real mistakes. Early in the war, I think it was September 1939, a German submarine snuck into Scapa Flow, which is where the main British fleet was, because out of the way up in Scotland, and sank a British battleship, the Royal Oak. And obviously somebody was asleep at the switch, because the Scapa Flow, going back to World War I times, had all kinds of nets and everything to keep submarines out. So somebody on the Royal Oak and somebody who's manning those nets didn't see this happening. And so the Royal Oak sank with heavy loss of life. I'm not sure why. It's in the harbor. It's the cold water of Scotland. It's up in Scotland, like the north of Scotland. So it doesn't get much colder than that in the British Isles. And there's a side story about this, by the way, that the reason the submarine got in and sank the Royal Oak was there was a German watchmaker there, an immigrant who came there between the wars, and he established himself as a popular watch and clockmaker. But what he really was a German spy. And so he knew when the gates were open for other ships to pass through, and he would signal to the submarine. He signaled the submarine that the gates are open now. You come on in and do your business. Well, the problem with that is, of course, there's no factual evidence of this the spy clockmaker, the clockmaker of Scapa Flow, and also um, this was to say that the main harbor of the British Navy. And there are all kinds of newer ships there, aircraft carriers and newer battleships and so on. He sunk the Royal Oak was an old battleship. It was so old that the British weren't quite sure what to do with it. They didn't feel it could be in the line of battle anymore. It was too slow, shore bombardment, something like that. But this supposedly they missed up on and sank the Royal Oak. With tragic, of course, the loss of seamen. There's a little chapel there dedicated to the 800 men who lost their lives on the Royal Oak, and it's still there. They have, I guess, they feel it's a tomb and just leave it there. So that the and then also when he was this was, I think, directly Churchill's failure that he sent aircraft carriers out to hunt submarines. And that's the only way to go to a submarine is attract them to a convoy. We found that out in World War I. So now here in World War II, he's sending aircraft carriers which are worth their weight in platinum, even this early in the war. And the Courageous was torpedoed and sank again with heavy loss. So basically, I say the Courageous was HMS Courageous was thrown away in a time when aircraft carriers were priceless. So that's another thing we could hold against Churchill. And I think, to be fair, I mean, not attacking him personally, just saying these are things that we should know that he wasn't that certainly wasn't perfect. Also, when he was prime minister in 1943, the Bengal famine took place, and the Indian leaders like Gandhi and Nehru were saying the province of Bengal is starving, and the British were taking what food that was in Bengal. They were shipping it over to their troops, who by this time they were fighting in Burma, and we hadn't landed on Normandy yet, but we were in Italy. So the British had requirements for food. They don't grow that much food in the British Isles, and they were taking so much out of India, and not just from Bengal, but other parts of other Indian states that could have shipped the food to Bengal over the fine British-built railways. They didn't do it. So about 1 million Indians died, but kind of like, well, since they were Indians, we didn't really hear about. I don't know if you heard about it at all, the Bengal famine. I should also mention here that Churchill, speaking of India, was opposed to Indian independence. Now, that's very unpopular today, because today with imperialism, that's a no-no. That's bad. Everybody, that's bad. That's bad. Leftist, rightist, whatever, that's bad. But he was an imperialist almost from the beginning to the end. After all, he fought in some of the victorious wars, imperialistic wars. He fought in the last British charge against the Mad Mullah at the Battle of Omdurman. I mean, he just loved it. I mean, there he was, lancers forward and shooting away. And he did say they're brave men. I mean, they just charged the British with the British had machine guns as well and were mowed down. I don't know why I'm laughing. Sorry about that. But Churchill, to him, that was a great moment in his life, the charge of at the Battle of Omdurman. And then he fought in the Boer War as well. He was captured, as you know, by the Boers, became a POW for a while. So he believed in imperialism, because the Boer War was to have control the British over formerly the formerly Dutch and then almost independent states of South Africa, Natal, the Orange Free State, and so on. So he came from his imperialism, honestly, you could say, because he was a part of it. He fought in it. And right through the end, he felt that Indians were not competent to rule themselves. I don't think it's like a racial thing, they're incompetent, but right now they've had no experience in government. And also, of course, the various sects, and as well as the tribes, Muslims versus Hindus versus Sikhs, various hill tribes and so on. In fact, he not only said that I don't want this, he said that it won't last. This new government under Nehru will not last. Within a few months, it will fall apart. Well, in a way, he was right, because there were they partitioned India between Hindus and Muslims, and they fell on each other and slaughtered each other. And so because the Hindus are moving out of Muslim Pakistan, which was a new state then, and the Muslims are moving out of India. And in this transition, lots of them died on the way and were killed on the way. It was a blood. Again, it might have been about 1 million. I mean, who's keeping track then? Who died during this? So in a way, Churchill was right, but still in the long run, and the Labour Party, they right from almost the get-go from the 1920s or 30s said, you get us in, and we will give India its independence. And lo and behold, they kept their political promise. 1947, India became under the British government, passed the various acts and so on, giving India its complete independence within the British Commonwealth. So again, I think today that would be considered a very bad attitude on the part of Churchill. Also, again, in World War II, he believed that India, or Italy rather, was the soft underbelly of Europe. And if we land there, we can just move on up and we'll be able to kind of stab Hitler in the back. Well, the problem was this soft underbelly, first of all, had a series of mountain ranges. Now, they weren't the Himalayas, but the Apennines and so on. For an infantryman, it's pretty hard to, get up and, and secure the crest of these mountains and the hills and so on. So it was just it was a war between one defensive German position after the other. There was the Gothic line and the Hitler line and so on. So the British and the Americans were in it by this time, and the Canadians and the Poles and the Brazilians. Like everybody fought in the Italian campaign except the Russians. Every Allied power fought in the Italian campaign. So it's just a weary, bone-crushing one line up one hill and down the other hill and up the next hill. And so that really slowed things down. And I won't blame this on Churchill, but when we invaded Sicily, and that was fairly easy, and then we were going to cross from Sicily fairly easily to the mainland of Italy. The Germans were able to take almost all of their men and equipment across the Straits of Messina and in Italy itself, because we were slow on the uptake. But that I wouldn't attribute that directly to Churchill, although as prime minister he had a lot to do with the decision, but it was an Allied decision. Another thing wrong with the Italian campaign would be that we had pretty much, I'd have to say, second string commanders. Whereas, in fact, one of the General Lucas was in charge of the landing at Anzio, and Churchill said, we expected to find a tiger. We found a beached whale, because he just kind of sat there. And the Germans, again, were quicker. And see, we had sort of just mediocre generals. The Germans had a very good, one of the best, Alfred Kesselring. We called him Smiling Alfred. And he just was he just able to withdraw. Once he realized the position couldn't be held, then stand to the last man, he just, withdraws a few troops 10 or 15, 20 miles north. And so just on and on. In fact, Italy was not cleared completely until nearly the end of the Second World War. So this was, they said, well, it absorbed all these German divisions. Well, it absorbed a lot of Allied divisions too. In fact, we had more divisions there. I can't get the exact numbers because they were varying all the time. We were adding more divisions, and they were getting more divisions, wiped out or retreating. So, but it was pretty much even Steven. We just had to winkle them out over a long period of time. It certainly didn't make the war end. It said Italy was finally the last parts of northern Italy were not evacuated by the Germans. I say evacuated until about April of 1945. And that's the time that Mussolini was captured and executed and hung upside down later on, he and his girlfriend. Mussolini, speaking of Italy, certainly if he had just stayed out of the war, it was a catastrophic decision. As Churchill said, the iron rake of war has passed over Italy. Even after Italy surrendered, the Germans just, again, under people like Kesselring didn't wear it. Oh, they've surrendered. They just moved German troops into Italy. So it was almost the very end of the war until the Italian peninsula was finally cleared. So that was Churchill's idea. He didn't just force it on the Allies, but that was his main idea. We do the soft underbelly of Europe, and it wasn't so soft. All right, that was a kind of mistake on his part. And then another disastrous mistake, and I think Churchill gets a lot of responsibility for this also, would be the decision to reinforce Singapore. Now, probably Singapore, the bastion, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was a bad idea to begin with because they had all these great guns facing out to sea because they're waiting for a Japanese navy to attack it. But I, I think it's a myth that the guns could not turn around. They could, but they say the coaxial cables wouldn't let them. I say chop the cables and turn the guns around to face the Japanese coming by land. But anyway, where Churchill was, he wanted to say, let's reinforce Singapore. And so they sent one battleship, the Prince of Wales, and a battle cruiser, World War One. Battle cruisers were a bad idea, but anyway, send a battle cruiser along, and then an aircraft carrier, and they were to proceed to Singapore. The problem was the aircraft carrier. I don't remember. I think it was the Audacious. Went aground in the Caribbean, and Churchill said, "Go ahead. We'd like to have it, but we don't need it." And we used the battleships to break up any Japanese landings on the or naval attacks or whatever. So the Prince of Wales and the Repulse made it to Singapore, and within, golly, 3 days, they were sunk by Japanese air power because the aircraft carrier wasn't there to at least give protection of a balanced fleet. And in fact, the commander of the Prince of Wales, Admiral Tom, they called him Tom Thumb because he was so short, but I can't remember his Tom Phillips, believed that a well-handled battleship can fight off enemy aircraft. You say, what about Pearl Harbor? Well, he'd say, well, Pearl Harbor, the ships are all anchored. They were tied up or anchored, so that's not fair. But if it's maneuvering and shooting back, we got lots of anti-aircraft fire. The Prince of Wales was a brand new battleship. It had just fought the Bismarck. Okay, they still had workmen on board, so he felt that, and he paid with his life for that belief because for all of his maneuverings, and he did a good job that way. The Prince of Wales and the Repulse were sunk with a fairly heavy loss of life. And again, I think we could attribute the loss of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse directly to Churchill because, first of all, he believed in empire. You see, in the keystone of the empire in the east was Singapore. So we got to reinforce Singapore. And if we got an aircraft carrier went aground, well, give it time, we'll get it unstuck and we'll take it around there. Well, the Japanese moved a little too fast for that. And Singapore became the greatest military disaster in the history of the British military. Well, we shouldn't boast about or kind of degrade them for that because our loss was at roughly the same time the loss of the Philippines. It was the same bad military decision. The Philippines, we fortified them. I talked about the concrete battleship of the Philippines. It's close enough to Japan to make the Japanese say, what are they doing here? They may interfere with our plan, an American fleet in the Philippines, but too far from America to reinforce them. Not a single surface ship. I think maybe one or two freighters got through, fighting their way through to the Philippines to reinforce. Other than that, basically every American in the Philippines was killed or captured, except for MacArthur and his staff, and except for a few soldiers that went and extended from the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor and went into the woods and fight his guerrillas. Interesting contrast there too. I can't think of any British troops in Malaya, Singapore, that fought along in the jungles, against the Japanese. It was the thing is morale even collapsed, and the troops were looting, getting drunk, disobedient, and they it was just really what the British call a cock up. It was just really bad, and that probably more than anything else undermined the whole idea of imperialism, which Churchill still believed in. That they need our guidance yet. You see, they're just they're not inferior exactly, but they're disorganized, chaotic, whatever. And Singapore showed how Asian people using Asian equipment like the Zero fighter can knock the stuffings out of Western people. I think at least the Americans went down fighting in the Philippines. I mean, I know they did, whereas in Singapore, it was kind of like, in fact, when General Percival, was one of those generals who's great in staff work. Oh, the troops got their mail, they were maneuvered here and there. Um, when he sent emissaries to say with white flag saying, well, we're ready to surrender now. The Japanese, General Hama said, what? You guys are ready to surrender? I mean, you outnumber us 2-1 and you're ready to give up? And sign on the dotted line. So at any rate, these are the things I was going to say that Churchill, he's a great man, maybe the one of the greatest of the 20th century. And he and Roosevelt, the two greatest men of the 20th century. But he had his weak spots, not in morality, right? He was a man of virtue. I certainly say that. And I say one of the highlights of my career, Mrs. Sandler, was her life was to pay homage to Churchill at his funeral, but just to say that he was also a great man, but he was a man. Well, thank you for listening. I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler, and stay tuned for another episode of Stan, the History Man. Bye-bye.